the question is, if you have more questions about Wojtyła and Hildebrand, or if we should proceed and kind of get to 3 nuggets in the chapter that actually or the 2 chapters that we were going to discuss this afternoon. So is there this, the feeling that there's much richer discussion to be had, or you have these burning questions about Wojtyła, and we can always do that also tomorrow afternoon. It looks like tomorrow afternoon will be pretty flexible and open. And so unless you raise your hand, and you can forever hold your peace, and we will go to the desire to be united and the desire to be loved in Hildebrand. Yes? Is this okay with everyone?
Can I ask one question?
Yes.
Jules, you had mentioned something earlier about the Hildebrand distinguished love and lust before the will plays into the choice. You were comparing it to Wojtyła. Now, I was wondering if what would, I guess I don't know, in our human nature, I find it hard to conceive that we can completely have this pure sense of love, that nothing is ever not infiltrated by some tiny aspect of lust or use. Like, we can have this ideal of love, but in reality, as fallen humans, there's always this tiny little aspect of us that we can overcome with our will. I wonder what Hildebrand would say about, there's that choice in saying, I feel this lust, but I'm not going to act on that. I'm going to act on the love part that I feel.
I knew I shouldn't have said it. I mean, first of all, I think it's very important to not think of lust as the desire for the enjoyment. I think that is not in and of itself lust. And Wojtyła also makes that point in Love and Responsibility. He makes some refreshing points, I think, that show not just in theory that sex is good and the pleasure involved in it is good, but he makes points that make that concrete. That's one of them. There's one passage where he talks about it. In fact, I think I'll mention it tomorrow. So the second point is whether we can ever have any sort of pure value response with no mixture of lust involved in it. I suspect we can, frankly, but that's a slightly different. I wasn't trying to make that point, that there's a mixture in virtually all human motivation seems to be pretty given. The essential point is to distinguish between the one and the other, and that it's a distinction already made in the affective response itself. So I can feel in myself, or maybe even notice in others, whether their response is one of lusting after or one of loving. I mean, for instance, again, to go to the discussion that we'll have really tomorrow, is the reaction of shame that particularly women might have when a man looks at them. In that reaction, I think very often it is a clear awareness. This is not a clean look. This is not an affirmative look. This is a using look. And so that man might not want that look. I mean, he may have, it may be a very spontaneous thing. So in that emotion itself is already the quality of inappropriate lusting rather than respectful loving. So that's all I want to say, that the affection itself already has either quality. This is why in Love and Responsibility, when Wojtyła distinguishes between the psychological analysis of love and the ethical analysis of love, I think Van Hildebrand would have an ethical analysis also about the affections, about the emotions. Because if the emotion is itself already intelligently related, meaningfully related to an object, then that relationship can be either adequate to it or fall far short of it. And so they already have an ethical significance. because they are intelligently related, meaningfully related to the object. And that is precisely why, or one of the major reasons why, he says they cry out for a sanction or disavowal of the will. The reason it's so important to disavow a lust in yourself, or, well, disavow you can only do it yourself. So if that arises in you, have to disavow it. Why? Because in and of itself, it has already a negative moral value, disvalue, and therefore you want to make sure that you distance yourself from that and don't, by not acting, become culpable and would make it part of yourself simply by not refusing it. And likewise, sanctioning a good moral response or a good affection, one reason you sanction it is so that the good, you benefit fully and truly from the goodness that's already inherently there. So if it was just a reaction like you get if somebody knocks you on the knee, where there's no ethical significance there whatsoever, therefore there's no sanctioning, nothing of that is necessary or required. And even if I do this and I kick Jesse here, it's not because I have some personal thing against him, it's not a response to him, it's just a reaction. Why? Emotions are not like that. They represent our response, our take, and therefore they have this ethical significance. And so, I don't know, maybe I said more or not enough to address your question. So, is our response, can it be fully adequate and therefore with no mixture of lust in it? Maybe it's rare, I don't know. I tend to think that there are many cases in which most people have pure responses, pure delight, say, in your children, not to talk about the sexual sphere, pure delight in your children, not mixed in with any pride, say, look at you over there with your children, my children are much greater than you. I mean, that may come in at some point, but normally it's a pure delight. And likewise, I think many effective responses are, on the whole, perfectly adequate. And I think in the sexual sphere and sphere of love, it seems to me you can also have those. I'm not as pessimistic as some, but there's always some kind of ugly lust at work. So, is that...
It's enough for now.
Okay, good. She's heard enough.
Okay. So, we are now going to just take a moment to pause and shift, because the two chapters that we're talking about are the chapter on the desire to be united and the desire to be loved, and then also the chapter on Eigenleben, this interesting Eigenleben and transcendence, which is so interesting in Hildebrand. Now, Hildebrand, in true style, begins when he says we have the implicit, essential to love is a desire to be united to the beloved. Yeah? And in sort of his true style, he of course begins by distinguishing many different forms of union, and I think that's very important. So he talks about a union between two metal balls, and he says actually, in fact, that's not really union, that's a fusion, because for union, the individual has to remain an individual. And then he talks about the union between personal beings and non-personal beings. So, for example, a work of art. He has a person, a work of art, or a person and a truth, and so forth and so on. And he makes actually a very interesting comment. He says, oftentimes, those unions can be deeper than personal, the unions between two persons. Like, it can be richer, yes? For example, when I'm in union with a truth, that would be a whole discussion for another time. We won't have time to go into that in this last half hour, and I'm going to keep to 4:30. But there is a kind of a union, though, even the one-sided, because it is the conscious person, yes? And both the conscious person and the object, the work of art or the truth, are disclosing themselves to each other, but the receptivity isn't there in both, yes? So it still remains one-sided, hence impoverished, not a true union. Now, the theme of union carries throughout von Hildebrand, and what's very interesting is that value response. His whole point is that we not only participate, but we can become united to these goods, that these values, and that union is something that we should really strive for. So then the final union is between two personal beings, an I and a thou. And then Hildebrand, again in his systematicity, says, well, of course, in between I and thou, there are many different kinds of union, many different levels. And so he talks about, for example, you have the relations of love, unions that result from a relation of love, or unions that come through forms of community. Yeah? So he talks about those. Ultimately, his point will be that in community, it's more of a solidarity than a true union. Yeah? What unites us is sort of a common, the common value, yes, or sometimes. So he then even makes a distinction between formal communities like associations and material unities like families, states, nations, etc. What the essential point here is that love is not necessary in community. Even in family, he says, family exists as a unity, yes, but love is not necessary. Of course, the family remains impoverished if there is no love. But we still belong to a family, even if there is no loving union within that family. So this is all to say that then he's gearing us towards ultimately that union that comes in and through love. And that this is a whole new form of union. And I think that sort of the greatest point, I want to talk about 2 points in this short time. Namely, selfishness and selflessness. These are sort of the 2 points that I find the richest points in these 2 chapters. So, in relations of love, we desire to be united with the beloved, and oftentimes, and we heard someone who thought that, yes, this is considered selfish because through this union comes we connect union and happiness. And so the idea is that when we seek union with another person, we're seeking it for selfish reasons because we want to be happy. Now remember, I think in Kierkegaard we hear much of this. This is why he places, of course, the love of neighbor, which doesn't seek such a strong union, far above other human relationships of love, because he thinks that this is the higher ideal. He thinks that this is the more selfless, yes, ideal, and it's less selfish, hence more Christian, and hence a greater form of love. Remember that first talk that we heard. Now Hildebrand, this is now where we hear now Hildebrand's voice, I think, directly to Kierkegaard. Hildebrand would reject that emphatically. And Hildebrand goes and he says, when we desire union with the beloved, and when this is essential to love, we are not primarily seeking happiness. The primary thing that we are after is the union, yes, with the beloved. Happiness is sort of the result. Happiness is what comes about. So our primary focus, our primary yearning is the union. And so he redefines union, if I can say redefines, because I think that he actually says something that's somewhat novel. He says, when I yearn for union, what I'm really yearning for is a return of my love. Because that's somehow when you have that mutual self-disclosure and you have that mutual self-gift, which of course will vary depending on what kind of relation. So the self-gift that you have between friends versus spouse, within a spousal love, of course there's going to be differences. And he says that the moment I become interested more in my happiness than in being united to the beloved, yes, that is the moment I actually stop wanting real union. You see, so he says, if it were really selfish, I wouldn't want union with the beloved. I would want to possess the beloved. And I think there we have a strong parallel also in something that Karol Wojtyła says when he talks about the danger of the will to possess. Yeah? So ultimately, Hildebrand, and here we come sort of to his final conclusion, if you will, ultimately he says that desire to be united, yes, which belongs essentially to love. In all categories of love, though not as much in the love of neighbor, constitutes the willingness and the fulfillment of commitment and value response. So to unpack that a little bit, I think that when I desire the union with the beloved, yes, I am seeking, I am willing this kind of mutual commitment, not just mine to the beloved, but also I am seeking the beloved's commitment to myself. I am seeking the fullness of the value response, because when I desire to be united, yes, I desire, and when I want that person to be united with me for the right reasons, for myself, for my own sake, not so that they can be happy. Yeah? And so I want them to give the fullness of a value response. And so true union happens only when love constitutes, or essential to love, the focus of love is on value response. Yeah? So the connection of the themes of love as value response to now this union, which happiness actually recedes a little bit into the background, and yet it is so important because happiness comes through union. They're essentially connected. It's just that the focus here is not as it's oftentimes been said to be, so that it's somehow self-seeking. Yeah? Now, with love to neighbor, do you follow me thus far? Maybe I should pause really quickly. Are there questions? No? Okay. Very good. With the love to neighbor, it becomes very interesting, because in the love of neighbor, there is still this desire to be united, but it's very, very different than in all other forms of love. So it's far weaker, and it lacks this fullness of union and commitment, yeah, that we find, for example, in spousal love. There's not this self-donation. He speaks, for example, of, I desire to be united eventually in heaven with my neighbor. So there is a kind of a desire. But I think that maybe on a natural level, we could even say, I desire to be in harmony with my neighbor. That's a form of union. A kind of a politically, or socially driven. I want to be sort of at peace and at harmony with those around. And that we could say that is already part of my desire for union with the neighbor. Now, and this is where it gets very interesting. So remember that Kierkegaard, yes, talks about the selflessness of the love of neighbor, and he upholds that. And I think that Hildebrand here makes a very helpful, brilliant distinction. Do you remember what it is? When he talks about the self, we've actually gone through so many texts today. I absolutely marvel at how much you've participated so far. But I'm wondering if you remember anything, because it really catches your attention, I think, the first time you read it. He talks about selflessness in connection with love of neighbor. Does anybody remember it or have it present enough that you can say something about it? So he would agree with Kierkegaard that the love of neighbor is selfless. But he qualifies. And I think it's a very, very important qualification. Yes?
This is the distinction between stepping out of my argument in contrast to abandoning it completely.
So he says that we have to distinguish between two forms of selflessness. One kind of selflessness is the opposite of selfishness. So it involves a kind of a death to self. Yeah? That's not what we have, he says, in love of neighbor. And now I find this very intriguing. He says love of neighbor. So love of neighbor, that selflessness, is wrongly upheld as an ideal, as a kind of a moral ideal, because we don't have the opposite of selfishness. The selflessness that we have in love of neighbor is a kind of stepping beyond our own subjectivity, stepping sort of beyond our own concerns, focusing just on the subjectivity of the neighbor. You see? Now, why is this intriguing, and why would he respond to Kierkegaard that in no way could this be an ideal for love? Because he connects very strongly, of course, love with self-donation, self-gift, right? So in true love, in the deepest forms of love, especially in spousal love, love culminates not just in the desire for union, but in the gift of self, right? And so the point is that you have to have a self to give, yeah? You can't have left somehow yourself behind and stepped outside of that self and stepped outside of the desires and everything that concerns that self, and then call it selfless in the same way, or speak of a self-donation, speak of this radical form of love that he calls us to, this deeper form of love. So he says the transcendence in the love of neighbor is a transcending my own subjectivity, right? But it is not a transcendence in the deeper sense, that involves higher levels of my subjectivity, where somehow I am within my subjectivity and I am taking my subjectivity into sort of to help it transcend itself, so to speak. You see, I'm carrying my subjectivity with it. Does that make sense? And so he suggests that this removal of my own person for the exclusive your own sake, this would be terrible in love. This would be a complete. It would completely make something. He says, self-contradictory of spousal love. It would be a pseudo heroism. It wouldn't be a supreme heroic commitment. If I go up to my spouse, right, and if I say, well, I love you, but I'm going to leave myself behind, or I'm going to sort of leave myself aside. You see, that would be terrible for a man to say that to a woman, or a woman to say that to the man. You would sense that there'd be something very wrong here. And it strikes me that when, especially Hildebrand's, I find his analysis of Eigenleben very rich, and I wish he would have developed it more, because I think that it's very fascinating how important for Hildebrand it is that the self stays intact, the life of the self. Do you see that somehow it is important, and again he would say happiness comes in love because the self stays intact, because the self hasn't eaten itself up alive, or hasn't sort of allowed itself to be devoured in love. Now, here's a practical example of what we're talking about, maybe. I mean, I don't know many of your situations, but think of the case of a mother, right? And her children leave the house. How many mothers do you know, right, who have defined themselves sort of in living for the sake of their children, yes? And they've done this so much that when the children leave, the objects of their love, all of a sudden they go through this fundamental crisis. They have no idea who they are. They have, and where you find the most frightening things, after 30 years or 40 years of marriage, the woman can wonder, I wonder if my husband would even still love me. Yes? I wonder, they sort of this self-doubt, or this, the moment where I think Hildebrand sort of speaks very richly here, because and I think that as Catholics, it's a very interesting message, because I think that we have very often misinterpreted the opposite of selfishness. When Christ says the death to self, that's so prominent in the Catholic faith. And I would suggest that we can't die to ourselves if there is no self to die to. You see, then it becomes a farce. Then it becomes, if I have no interest, and if I have no life of my own, if I'm not a flourishing individual, then that kind of death to self becomes an empty, I think, and more broken and very impoverished form of selflessness. And I think that that's what Hildebrand is trying to get at here. So when he, now mind you, this kind of, especially in a day and an age where selfishness rules in some sense, it's also rampant. Yes, and we have this very bizarre difference between. It's a very paradoxical situation, but of course there is this kind of almost overemphasis or over focus on my subjectivity, my life in this selfish absorption. Yes, with Eigenleben. So it's very tricky, and I think that Hildebrand doesn't develop enough what this proper love of self would mean, what this proper sort of how we can foster our own subjectivity, our Eigenleben, yes, without being selfish. I think that there's much room. He sort of sets the stage, and it's an incredibly, I think, important stage, especially in the discussion of love. But then he sort of leaves us floundering a little bit because, I mean, this true and proper self-love, of course, is, I think, far harder to achieve than a proper love of another in some sense. It's far more difficult to have this, I think, ordered relationship with oneself than it is with another, which is perhaps why we can get so focused on that. So it would seem to me that you could find all of this implicit in sort of Hildebrand's writings. So the key here, right, and the key here is simply as a reminder, you have the discussion of selflessness and of selfishness. Is love selfish? Is the desire to be united with the beloved, is that really a selfish desire? Is it self-seeking in some sense? You know, is it because of a neediness or because of something because we desire primarily the happiness? And he would reject that for reasons mentioned. And then he would move to those who suggest that selflessness, in particularly the love of neighbor, is the highest ideal. And he would say, no, that's a different kind of selflessness than the selflessness that is the opposite of selfishness. And in that case, it is important. He has this focus on Eigenleben and Transcendent. So, for example, where he says the richer, you know, it's a very interesting thing where he says the richer the self, the richer and the more intact the self, the more able the self is then, of course, also to transcend, especially in the moral realm, right? Because they have so much more to give. You see that self-possession? I think Wojtyła uses that language even more. Because I possess myself, I have not lost myself, and because I possess myself and because I have remained intact, therefore I am so much more capable to give in love, richly in love, right? But that love requires, and it's perhaps in the structure of the human person, John Crosby develops has a very extensive sort of passage also when he develops the solitude, that important moment of, you know, that we're not just in communion, but we're also in solitude, that richness, and only when that there's this mutual relationship. So the more that I have this intactness, the more then I can bring into communion, the more then I can enrich again in solitude. So there has to be this sort of dialectical relationship in love. You see, love is gift. It is the gift of myself to the other, but it is not at the expense of myself. It is not to the point of the annihilation of myself. It is not to the point of the exhaustion of myself, because otherwise the love becomes depleted and then becomes eventually very impoverished. So I would say, because I was now trying to narrow it down to just sort of the two most central points in these chapters, that is what I would draw from Hildebrand, and we have 10 minutes to discuss it. And then perhaps tomorrow we can carry it over into the afternoon session, depending on what we decide to do with the morning. So, questions? Yes.
This is still like forming, but I was just thinking about how, like, in theology, often we talk about God's love working through you, and like it almost sounds like in this discussion, like I feel like I would have a tendency to start thinking of myself as the one who's like conjuring up this love, because like I'm making like my identity, and then also like love other people better. Like, how do you preserve the this sense of your own identity while still understanding that, like, ultimately the love is coming from God, if that makes sense.
Well, I mean, I think that, I mean, particularly in the love of my spouse, I mean, I wouldn't say that it's God loving my spouse. I mean, I think that, like, love has to be my response to my spouse. You know, now I may be receiving, of course, and that's where Hildebrand, of course, talks about the gift of the gift of the affection, or the gift of love, right? That love is not something we give to ourselves, but that depth maybe of love, you know, that I can understand how God gives me the grace of that. But I mean, it would be very bizarre if I began to think in terms of, well, actually it's God giving a value response and he's using me as a means to give a value response. So, I mean, in that sense, it seems very true to our experience to say that it comes from me, yes, and that I mean, it comes from me in the sense that I have to be the one to give my yes and to give my love and to give myself, yes, to the beloved. So
I guess I'm trying to, I think there's a danger, or, like, things I've dealt with, a danger in thinking that, like, we ourselves can just conjure up all this love to give everyone, and it's like all in our, maybe I'm thinking more of love of neighbor.
I mean, it would seem precisely to me that I don't know, that somehow one would have to connect it with, it is precisely, I can't give it all. Like, there has to be sort of also that replenishment. You know, there has to be receptivity of the self somehow in order to be able to give. But I have to be willing to receive it somehow also, you see, to be replenished. I mean, I don't know, if you could somehow pinpoint maybe your question. I feel as though I'm being as broad in my response maybe as you are in your question. I'm not quite sure I'm able to yes?
I'm wondering if the experience of the heart that you referred to earlier is gives some insight into it. That rather than thinking as Rutiwa does, at least in one sentence, which maybe is not entirely representative, where he talks about the will having this, being vested with the power to create love. Von Hildebrand would say that love is this gift that wells up inside of us. And so in this experience, we experience both that it is a gift, that we couldn't possibly have done this ourselves, and at the same time, he describes it as the voice of our true self. So we experience simultaneously our own being speaking, and yet we know that we are dependent on another power for being able to speak this way. And so it seems to me that's a very fruitful experience of understanding that both that it, and also the notion, the term Von Hildebrand uses for the freedom that you spoke about earlier is, and I'm not sure if you even used it, is cooperative freedom. The freedom here cooperates with, in some ways, God's initiative in our soul. And God's initiative doesn't in any way substitute ourselves. It is rather awakening ourselves. And so all of that seems to be very fruitful also from in a very Catholic way almost of speaking of the will, is cooperating with grace. And in the ethics where he speaks about cooperative freedom, he mentions various perfections of the will. And he says that we often think of the will acts where we ourselves are in control and where we initiate the act as the highest form of freedom. He thinks it's precisely this cooperative form of freedom which is the highest form of freedom. So, just some thoughts I thought might help on that.
I really do think that here in this, when he is talking about the Eigenleben, I mean, I think that the danger really, is so much that we sometimes think of love as we can't think of ourselves at all. Like he sometimes refers to this extreme altruism, right? I can't think of myself at all. I can't do anything for myself. If I do that, then that's selfish. You see, and I think that is a very, very particular danger for mothers. And now that I'm a mother, I do. I mean, because you feel as though there's something so important. You see, but it doesn't matter how important that is. If you realize that, that self-gift becomes less and less if you lose yourself in the process. And that ultimately love becomes this pseudo gift that That you see where the strain becomes so great. And so this is what I really appreciate, I think, in Hildebrand's analysis, that he shows that the capacity for a rich love depends on a rich person, or a person who lives fully also from their center and as their own person, not in a selfish way, but at the same time, you see, not in a selfless, in this obscure way. I saw your hand, I thought. Yes?
Yeah. I just was thinking about how to capture these two senses of selflessness in as simple a way as possible, and I came up with this. What I think you want to say is that the desire for a requital of my love is not necessarily selfish. That those loves, like the love of friendship, where I want my friend to love me in return, or love between man and woman, where I want to be loved in return, are not therefore selfish loves. And love of neighbor, where I'm not so concerned about having my love requited, is not more selfless. In other words, the moral defect of selfishness can infect both the love of neighbor and the love between man and woman. And so the selflessness that avoids selfishness, that we need in all kinds of love. But the selflessness, which is the signature of love of neighbor, that's something else. And if you identify that selflessness, which is the signature of the love of neighbor, with the morally ugly, or the morally good selflessness, then you get the conclusion, well, there's something suspicious about those loves that look for a requital. They are flawed inherently by selfishness. And then you get the Kierkegaard position. Only love of neighbor really counts as love. So that idea of, and it's noticed in Wojtyła, 85, 86, it's a very clear affirmation of the fact that the desire for requital has nothing to do with selfishness. And you don't have to practice only love of neighbor in order to be selfless in that moral sense. So I was trying to reduce the simpler terms and probably it's still more complicated.
No, and very helpful, especially if you begin to, I think the more you begin to reflect on that, because when I desire, right, a proper value response, if I desire the requital of love and true love, then of course that implies that the other also wants what's best for me and will look out, will help me to flourish as a person, to stay intact as an individual, not to become a kind of a melting ball that eventually fuses myself into the life of everyone I'm serving. Do you see? So I desire this love and this true love, which also does very much make me a part of the concern of love. I would even go so far, and I think that Hildebrand himself doesn't say it explicitly like this, but that, Hildebrand in various places says, value response, I cannot simply respond to one value and not to others. Like when we live on the level of value response, we're called to respond appropriately to all values. And I would say, with self-love, proper self-love, we also have to have the proper response to our own value. It would seem very obscure to set up this kind of idea of love in the person where I'm responding appropriately to everyone. Yes? But then somehow downplaying or ignoring, you see, a kind of a proper response to my own value, which is more difficult, I think. That one's very tricky. So we were talking about how I think that that could be developed more in Hildebrand.